and welcome to our final forward thinking discussion for 2021. I am thrilled to welcome today both Cord Davis and Melissa Bridges. We were hoping to get them to speak at Forward 50 and run workshops there, but when that didn't work out, we decided it'd be great to get them on for a conversation about some of the work they've been doing around data privacy and workshops with different organizations. I'm sure it's going to be a wide-ranging conversation. So I'd love to bring Cord and Melissa on, and we can talk a little bit about what they've been up to. Hi, Cord. Hi, Melissa.
Hi there.
Hi there.
Thanks for being here. It's too bad we couldn't get you on stage at Forward 50. It was a great conference. I'm sure we'll get you there sometime soon. But before we get started, why don't the two of you tell us a little bit about yourselves and the work you do?
I guess I'll go first. I'm Melissa Bridges. I am the former now Performance and Innovation Coordinator for the City of Little Rock. What that means is I was essentially the de facto Chief Data Officer, Chief Performance Officer, and Chief Innovation Officer, all rolled into one. Held that position for about 6 years, ran our open data performance and lean process improvement and innovation work, and have just recently transitioned out of local government and into the private sector, and am a senior client success manager for Tyler Technologies.
Awesome. And Cord, what do you do and how do you know Melissa?
Great. Yeah, thank you. I'm an independent consultant, and I've been working in data literacy and analysis education primarily for about 4 years now. I met Melissa at Little Rock about 4 years ago. She was the client sponsor and lead stakeholder for a series of data workshops that we did together that kind of snowballed and grew into a program that she and I collaborated on designing, and that was implemented at the City of Little Rock, which I imagine we will talk in significant more detail shortly.
And Cord, you've written a book on the ethics of big data that talks about the trade-offs there. So maybe just quickly, you can talk about the work you've done and why there's such a trade-off in that place.
Yeah, I think one of the outcomes. So the book came out about 10 years ago, 11 years ago now, and I think one of the outcomes of that work that I did, initially thinking about some of the ethical implications of big data, were that we realized that the degree of understanding about how data works in our lives amongst the working population and most people in most types of organizations needed to be increased. There needed to be greater awareness, greater agility and ability to not only talk about data with coworkers, but also to understand the implications of various kinds of data analysis, and most significantly to improve ways in which individuals can communicate not only the analysis that they've done, but to tell stories about how that data is being influencing policies and procedures and business processes and all manner of things. And I was hired to design a data academy for an organization that was acquired by Tyler Technologies, and that's how Melissa and I came to know each other, and I'm excited about talking about some of the ways in which Melissa saw those changes in the increase in data literacy help the City of Little Rock.
So Melissa, you obviously had quite a broad purview, like a lot of responsibilities in Little Rock. Can you talk to me about the changes in culture you saw around the use of data to make decisions at the start of your tenure and at the end of it?
Sure. I would say that at the beginning, when we kind of started down this road about 6 years ago, I was in the role of the network security manager. So my mindset was of protect the data, keep the data, don't share the data, keep it all unto itself. And I think kind of that mindset shift had to cross over to no, there's cross collaborations here that need to be taking place. There's things that are happening in our community that not only involve the police department, but also involve maybe our code enforcement division. And it may all happen at the same exact street address, and it's getting touched by multiple points that are creating additional data points. But nobody had insights into each other's information to be able to have that additional knowledge. So I think a lot of the work was around just having those conversations with the individual departments to say, what would it take? What would it make? How could we make your job easier? If you as a firefighter showed up at my home and you had additional pieces of information about things that have happened at that address as far as the city is concerned, whether it be past police incidents, past 311, non-public safety requests that I've put in, just additional data points that might give a more holistic view into what they're walking into as a city employee, whether it's, again, public safety or planning permit or those type things. So there was definitely a mind shift that had to take place amongst the entire organization. The thing that I think is kind of unique about Little Rock, and something that was kind of unique about as I was having conversations with other cities and other local governments across the country, was we actually at the time had a police chief that truly believed in that cross collaboration, breaking down those silos. And he was actually one of our biggest champions of, no, you guys can all have my information. Let me make sure that I'm sharing what I have freely. Whereas most other entities, that's the very last department that wants to share their information because they think, oh no, we're special, we're the police, we're public safety, we can't give that information out. So it was really nice because we kind of had that inside track to be able to have that departmental level champion that understood the benefit of having that other operational information with us.
So getting the right people at the table is obviously a huge factor, and you were lucky enough to have someone who kind of believed in that stuff. Do you have any concrete, we'll come back to that in a sec, but can you give me some concrete examples of like things that actually happened? Do you have like real world outcomes from this kind of change that you made?
Absolutely. So probably the most recent one that's been going on in Little Rock, we, like every other city across the country, have seen an uptick in violent crime. A lot of that's been driven by the pandemic the last couple of years and different pressures that are now on having families together in spaces that weren't used to being in spaces together all the time. So the thought was, okay, well, the police department is responding to this, but the police department cannot take care of every issue, especially because there's a lot of social pieces that go to that and economic pieces that go to that. So one of the things that we did early in 2021 was say, okay, what are these addresses that we're seeing over and over and over again come up in our system and having to have responses come to? And so actually the police department, our fire department, and our Housing and Neighborhood Programs Department, specifically with the code enforcement officers, all teamed up together and said, let's get tactical about this. Let's look at those addresses that we're seeing these repeat issues and start drilling down a little bit deeper and see if we can figure out, is there a root cause that's driving either this higher number of code issues that are happening or these higher number of domestic violence calls that are happening. And they all started going out kind of in little SWAT teams, for lack of a better way of saying it, and going to those sites and doing all hands on deck inspections. We've got a couple large apartment complexes that were having issues. So they'd go in and work with the apartment management and say, hey, look, you've got these life safety issues that are happening as far as things that we're seeing on the property, and that may be driving some of these crime issues. And so the city kind of took a different perspective at it and came together as a team approach. One of the early projects that CORD was actually a part of that came out of one of our very first data academies was gathering different folks from different departments, frontline employees, boots on the ground, folks that are out in the field, to back end people that were doing purchase orders and those type things that wouldn't necessarily be in a room together. And looking, and we specifically drilled in on a place, and we started with, here's this neighborhood that we know has various sundry issues in it, but let's look at it from every different angle that we can look at and see what information do we have. We actually had some folks from some local nonprofits that were in the room as well, in the local university, so that they could kind of bring their perspective to the table. And we looked at thinking, oh, okay, well, the number one thing that's going to come out of this conversation is there's going to be crime, and we're going to have to figure out that issue. But lo and behold, through the course of the 2 days and looking at the information and doing the projects and having those different perspectives together, the X on the map moved slightly, and it shifted itself to a specific neighborhood. So we reached out to that neighborhood association and said, hey, would you mind if we came and talked to you? Because we've kind of done this initial internal analysis, and we think this is what's happening. This is what we're seeing in the data, but we want to kind of have a gut check with you all and have that conversation and see, is this truly what's happening? And so we actually ran a half-day workshop with those neighborhood people using, again, some of the human-centered design skills and some of those open-ended questions and figuring out how to have those conversations, because most folks, when you say the word data, glaze over out in the neighborhood. But having questions about, help me prioritize. What are the important things in your neighborhood? Is it that you're missing a sidewalk? Is it that your street light is out? Is it that you want more police present? Is it that you've got a lot of rental property in the neighborhood? And through that process of being able to have those folks in the room and have our people that had done that initial analysis, the number one priority that popped up was the fact that the neighborhood felt that their neighborhood was unsafe because it was so dark at night. There was a school adjacent to the neighborhood, and the parents didn't feel safe picking their children up and walking back into the neighborhood. They didn't feel safe going out at night because it was so dark. And come to find out, the streetlights were out. And they didn't understand the process of interacting with the city to get their streetlights out. And it was as simple as either a phone call or using a mobile app. And so we partnered with them. And again, because of the safety issue, they didn't feel good enough going out and going through their neighborhood to put all those requests in. So we partnered with a local university and a fraternity that was there and got some kids that needed some community service hours to come out on a weekend. And we used Google Street Maps and created a route and went systematically through that neighborhood to be able to input those requests for them, and then follow up and track that information on the back end so that they could see, you're getting this service that you told us was your number one priority, and let's follow up and continue to make sure that your lights stay on. And then we kind of were able to build on that and create this whole campaign called Lights on Little Rock that we could then take out to all of our neighborhood associations and marketed it to all 168 of them and said, hey, if you've got this issue in your neighborhood, here's a little 4-page instruction on how you too can create your own route map in it. And one of the neighborhoods that I thought was just great, because I have kids, one of the moms and her son took it on, and it became kind of like a Pokemon Go. Let's go find the out streetlights and put them into the 311 map and make sure that folks know that they're there. And then a week later, they were able to see the truck show up to fix the lights, and we're able to take
That's
pictures.
amazing. We actually had there's an organization called DTPR. It's Jackie Liu spoke about it. It's basically an open source standard for things in our world. So like there may be a traffic light camera, but it's just sitting there and you don't have any recourse. And they're setting up QR codes for everything. So you go, this traffic light camera was installed by these people. It collects this information. Here's how to find out about it. And it does seem like as we have interactive tools, the possibilities for getting a community to engage with the public sector environment that surrounds it and make them feel like they're not just, having this foisted upon them, but actively curating and caring for the infrastructure is kind of empowering in some ways. It makes people feel less helpless and just at and that kind of thing probably restores trust in democracy in some ways, because now you're like, yeah, I'm a part of this, right?
Exactly. And that's what we found through going out and talking to all the different neighborhood groups. The question I would always ask, because I'd see everyone had a mobile device laid in front of them, and I would ask, do you know about 311? Do you know about the app? And usually about half the people in the room, A, had never heard that they could ask for that service from the city, and B, didn't know how to download the app and put it on their phone. So that was something that I could show them how to do in 5 minutes or less. And to your point, yeah, they became owners and went, oh, I can put in a request to get something cleaned up in my neighborhood. Oh, I can put a request in because I see something broken in a park. And they finally felt like they were a part of the solution instead of just feeling helpless about it. So it was very empowering.
Melissa, could you talk a little bit about So these are awesome outcomes, and we've given about 20 of these kind of workshops in about a dozen different cities across the country. And we designed the workshop experience very specifically using human-centered design and design thinking tools and approaches, structured agendas and all manner of tools and tips and tricks. We've seen these kind of very real world, almost immediately practical outcomes in many different areas, many different cities, in many different at many different levels of the organization. Could you talk a little bit about your experience from the first? I seem to remember the first time we had an initial call to talk about how we were going to do this workshop, and I think after we'd gotten to know each other for a while, you admitted that you had no idea what we were talking about or how we were going to do it, but that then, when you saw it in person, you saw that, the cross collaboration between individuals who were passionate about a particular issue in their community, but didn't know that there were other people in other departments who were equally passionate. They all of a sudden got together and they're building relationships, and they're practicing better data communication. Could you talk a little bit about how that process and that experience went for you?
Yeah, and I think that's a really great way to describe it, because I think when, myself included, even though I was the quote unquote data person, heard the words Data Academy, I'm thinking, okay, well, you're going to teach us how to do SQL queries, or how to
Right.
use R or Python, or figure out how to visualize, or those type things, and not necessarily how to understand what question to ask.
Well, I remember, so I think we've done 4. We did 4 in Little Rock. I remember the very first one, somebody, we do a plus delta pro con at the end of all the workshops, and their feedback was, I was told to be here in this workshop, and I didn't think I was qualified because I don't know anything about, Excel or SQL or data or whatever, but now I understand that data operates in my job as a code enforcement officer in ways that I didn't really understand, which I thought was pretty awesome for somebody to be able to make that transition.
Yeah, that was Carla. She was our code enforcement officer that was actually in charge of the physical area where we held the class at.
Right.
And Carla's gut reaction, because she called me when she got the invitation and said, "Oh my God, Melissa, what are you making me come to? I don't know what this is, and you're using the word data, and that scares me." And I said, No, it'll be okay. It'll be okay. This is about figuring out how to work better together. And yeah, she became the star. And actually, I've still got a magnet on my refrigerator because she was driving home from work thinking about all the things that we had talked about those 2 days, and came up with this acronym that said, Little Rock, let's make some noise. And it was neighbors organizing together to make a safer environment. And I was like, oh my gosh, this is brilliant. You became the rock star. There you go. That's it. I love it.
It's hanging on my fridge. Yeah.
I look at it every day and think that came from Carla, who was the person who said, I don't know what you're talking about when you say the word data. And once she got in there and understood, oh, I'm the one that has the operational knowledge, because I'm the one that's out driving the streets, walking the streets every day, and know who these people that live at these addresses that you have all this information on actually are, and what the actual problems are.
My other favorite experience that happened all the time around that collaborative interaction was, the way we set it up was that we asked people to do a little affinity mapping and some dot voting to pick the topics that they wanted to work on. And they got to opt into the small groups or small teams that represented the issues that they were most interested in. And almost every time we would take a little break and we would ask people, how are you doing? Where are you at? And they would say, this is great. We're really engaged in this. We have this data and this data, but it would be really cool if we had this other kind of data too. And 8 times out of 10, somebody across the room would go, "Oh, we have that in our department," and they would go, "Really?" They would say, "Yeah, let me go ahead and give that to you." So, just increasing awareness and the ability to talk about, data questions and data problem statements. It really underscored, one of our top 3 sort of headlines is from DJ Patel, "Data is a team sport," and it really underscored that reality to people who don't normally work with data every day in their day jobs. That it's very much a collaborative conversation between people with multiple skill sets and multiple perspectives that allow that fuller data narrative to come to the top.
Yeah, and I think the other thing that was very organic in those conversations that was amazing for me, somebody that had 15 years of public service, and well, I don't know that I was ever jaded because I'm very much the Pollyanna, I'm going to go save the world person. It was, I always told everybody in my title, I had the word performance and I had the word innovation, but I also had the word coordinator. And to me, that was the most important of the 3 words, because it was that connection piece. And it was, to your point, figuring out what was that piece of the puzzle that they were missing, because the group that came together with that idea of, hey, let's go talk to this neighborhood, included somebody from our sustainability office who was all about telling people about how to recycle, had the purchasing manager from the zoo on it, had one of our GIS folks, had our intern at the time. It was a very diverse, cross-dimensional group. And some of the folks from the outside that came in, we had some students from the computer science department at the local university, so that they could understand, oh, this is what I might be able to use my degree for one day. Right. Be able to stay in my local community and help, because there's opportunities to use this skill set that I'm learning. And we had a volunteer who was in charge of one of the programs at the local AARP office, because we said, all right, well, let's get that perspective. One of the other folks that we had was from the Arkansas Health Information Group that came in, because they were coming at it looking from a health perspective, because they knew that they had information. And while most of the information that they had was protected private information that they couldn't necessarily freely share with us, they had some higher level demographic information that they knew that they had available that they might be able to share with the city, so that we could get an idea of what health information do we have about the people that live in these neighborhoods? Because we knew from a city perspective what information we had, but we were missing some of those other components to get a more holistic
and that
our resident.
And that diversity of participants and levels of expertise and experiences, I feel like one of the strongest arguments in favor of taking this approach to data literacy and data education around, human-centered design and design thinking approaches, because let's face it, a lot of people are not super familiar with the workshop approach. They're not super, the words design thinking seem a little woo-woo. People are often skeptical in the beginning, but when you can see in a real world situation that wide variety of people with that wide variety of access to a wide variety of data could come together to create a strong and compelling narrative that it helps to build consensus around community. It helps to deepen the collaboration and the culture of data in an organization. And I would just, I thought the way you guys did that, little bits at a time. One of our other headlines is, just start doing it. Collaboration is free. Don't announce that next Tuesday at noon you're going to be a data-driven organization. Start with little projects. Start with little data sets. And pretty soon people are noticing that, that's actually pretty effective. And you guys seem to be like you're having fun at work. So maybe I want to try and do it that way too.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the other things that came out of having that diverse group of folks in the room, because again, we had everybody from frontline to higher up management folks that didn't necessarily know who each other were. I knew them because my position sat in the middle of the organization, and so I
Right.
had a lot of touch points, but they didn't necessarily know each other, and they didn't know who to talk to when they needed things because
They literally didn't know who to call. Yeah.
exactly. Yeah. Not only were our residents feeling the I don't know who to call at the city to ask for stuff, but our own internal folks didn't know.
Yeah.
And so I think the other big part of it was as we were having those conversations around, oh, you need this piece, or oh, I'm the owner of that, or yeah, I can help you. That's also where some of the data quality work came in as well, because I know one of the data sets that we were looking at that we were trying to figure out how does this fit into that conversation was the business license data set.
Right.
Working through the treasury manager, who's the owner of that information, and her being able to share that out with me, we were able to initially see, oh my gosh, yeah, we've got some major data quality issues here, and you don't have any standard procedures in place.
Right.
That was a whole part of the data culture that was missing at the city. And it's a lot of organizations because it's just kind of this, you produce this stuff, but you don't think about on the front end, what are the rules and the structures and privacy concerns and confidentiality and destruction when you're done with it, those type things about what should this look like and standardize so that you can compare apples to apples.
I think Alistair has a question.
I have lots of questions.
Okay.
So I think first of all, you think about DJ saying that it's a team sport. It's not just team sport; it's iterative. Like the fact that people go in assuming they're going to get an answer and leave, as opposed to they're going to have a conversation with and about the data, and then you realize something, and oh look, it's actually that place over there. And who knew that this building? The problem with this building was the lighting by the school, right? I love the idea, though. It's like boiling the ocean, right? Like there's so much you could do. I love your idea of like, let's focus on this city block, or let's focus on this address, and then work back from that and generalize and say, we could do this for all addresses. This is the process. This is the data we need. So you almost create a microcosm as the first case study. The question that I have from this, I guess, is you've got privileged information in there. If you have a firefighter who knows that there was a domestic disturbance at that address, which may affect how they move in or whatever other, that there's an issue with how garbage is collected and there's a restaurant that's had like certain food rating, who knows what the data is. Some of that is in the public record. Some of it is confidential or privileged in some ways. How do you first of all decide if you're allowed to look at it, decide who should see it, and then like retroactively put in some kind of governance so that you've got permission controls? Because challenges of the data, as I'm sure you both know, are often not the data, but who can see it and how do you control permissions? That's where it gets really complicated. So how did you get past the sort of initial optimism where people are making fridge magnets and calling each other on the way home from the meeting because it's so good, into the, oh wait, now we need governance and policies and all that role-based administration? How do you deal with the hangover, I guess?
I think that was kind of the cool part about me having worn the network security manager hat first, because I had been so heavily into that thought process of, oh, this is PII, oh, this is PCI. I mean, you name an acronym, and we were trying to figure out how do we secure it? How do we make sure that nobody has access that they shouldn't have access to? And making sure that people had the education that they needed to understand why you can't give out that information. Our business license data set is a perfect example of that. It was a really good learning experience for that division because they knew that the city was doing this open data thing. Oh, well, we've got to get that out there because that's stuff that people ask for all the time. And so their initial thought was, well, we can just plop that in an Excel spreadsheet and put a link to it out on our website and folks can just download it from there. I happened to actually trip upon it one day and looked at it and I went, you've got personal email addresses and personal cell phone. No. And had to make a quick phone call and say, this needs to come down. It needs to come down now. And this is why. So there was kind of that thought around it. And then the good part was when we truly started down this road, the very first thing we did with help from the Sunlight Foundation was actually stand up an open data policy, which required us to create a data governance committee. And thank goodness that the person at the time who was our representative from our city attorney's office, our deputy city attorney, got it. He understood why we were trying to do it, because we as a local government entity were having to deal with freedom of information requests all the time, and that balance of what can you give out, what can't you. And Arkansas as a state has one of the most open freedom of information laws on the books. I think Florida's is maybe the only one that's wider open than ours because it's default open everything. But he got it and he understood. And while it took a minute to figure out, okay, what is and what's not, to your point, we had to make some conscious decisions as a governance group about, well, while this technically would be releasable under FOIA, it's not best practice to use it in open data. It's not best practice to put it out publicly. A good example of that is one of the services that you can request if you are an elderly person or if you're someone that has a disability and you need assistance getting your garbage to the curb so that our automated trucks can come pick it up, we will come by and we will do that for you. We did not want to publicize the addresses of where that service was being put because that might make them a vulnerable person. Same thing for instances of rape. We did not want to publicize the address of any of the victims that had been a victim of that particular crime and any associated crime that might have happened in the progress of that. So we stripped all addressing from that. We would still report there was a rape that happened on this day at this time, but we would strip all the information out so that it wouldn't become identifiable. One of the last data sets that I worked on before I transitioned out of the city was our 911 calls, our CAD information. And to your point about things being iterative, national best practice is now to anonymize that information. It's not to say this happened at 123 Main Street. It's to say it happened in the 100 block of Main Street.
And hey, Melissa, sorry to interrupt. Stepping back real quick on the question of the process of how the Data Governance Committee made certain decisions. Could you talk just a little bit about that? I mean, was that an open discussion and a debate about whether or not we should have addresses where violent crimes took place, and was that on a case-by-case basis, or was there some kind of framework? You and I actually haven't talked about that part of it too much, and I know you had a whole active group of data governance folks that met on a regular basis, and I'm just kind of curious to peek inside that a little bit.
Yeah, that was actually a really iterative thing as well, because when we very first stood up that group, again, the thought was, oh, this is a new thing. We've got to have the department directors at the table because they're the ones that are going to lead the charge on this. So it was kind of a voluntold situation from the city manager to those department heads, thou shalt once a month. Wait. And Melissa will let you know, and you show up and you participate.
Voluntold?
Voluntold?
Yeah.
That's a new one to me, yeah.
Yeah.
You've been voluntold. It didn't
work so good because I literally had some folks falling asleep in the meetings.
That's good.
So kind of took a step back and said, I don't think this is going to work. And had to go, who are those people in the departments that may not necessarily be at the top, they may be a layer or two or all the way at the bottom, that get it, that might have come to a data academy, that might have shown up for one of our lunch and learns, that might have had a conversation, but that understand what the heck it is we're trying to do. And so we replaced them slowly but surely on that data governance group and gave them a set of education that they had to go through to have that seat and participate. And it became a requirement that they did that education. And it was through national organizations that we were participating in that had best practices around all these different things. So that gave it more form and structure and framework. But then to your point, as those conversations came up, the process was, if we had a new data set that was getting ready to get published, part of the process was it had to run through governance. It had to be an open discussion of all of those people. And we had to go through that kind of plus delta conversation. What are the pros of this? What are the cons of this? We know we want to default to open, but where does that ick factor come in? Where does this crossing the line and putting somebody at risk by putting this information out come in? And so that was kind of the balancing act that we had to do with every piece of information that we were putting out.
So full-time job.
So we got to wrap up soon, but I did want to underscore, there's been a lot of talk about rethinking how policing is happening, that not every 911 call needs to wind up with, someone with a gun out. And it seems to me like the key to solving this is context. That when you know that this would be better served by a social worker, or that this thing's super urgent, this one's not, or, what kind of environment you're going into for anybody, that just seems like, taking a big step back, instead of taking a polarizing position one way or the other, taking a step back and saying, how do we get more context? How do we get more people in the room? So, and then when those people are the right people to have in the room, but they maybe aren't as literate in data, getting them trained up on it is a really good progressive step for any city. So in terms of what's happened since this kind of data was in place in Little Rock, have you seen changes in policing, in emergency response, in costs, in citizen sort of satisfaction? How's that turned out?
Definitely on the public safety side of it, there's been three major things that have happened through this process. Our different departments, including our public safety departments, have hired full-time data people to help them understand, what do we have, what are we doing with it, what does that mean, and how can we make better decisions. Our police department took it one step further, and to your point, actually hired social workers that will help sit in the 911 center, listen to those calls, and figure out, this is a mental health call. This is not I need somebody with a gun to show up call, and or do ride-alongs with our uniformed officers to co-respond potentially. Because we have a pretty good homeless population here, and being the capital city, we also get a lot of the reentry population. So we're trying to figure out, how do we co-respond? And the other piece of it is, our 911 center was always historically it was a division in our police department. That has now changed. It's now moved out from underneath them, and they've hired a civilian communications manager that is in charge of that. And she actually reports underneath the fire department, because the fire department they're all EMT trained. Over 85% of their calls are medical calls, not firematic calls. So they come at it from just a different mindset. So there's definitely been some shifts over the last couple of years, thinking, how do we do this better? Because we know the kind of calls that we're getting in, and how do we actually respond with the right response?
That's amazing. And Cord, I want to ask you quickly, we've talked a lot about these workshops. They seem to be magical. What goes into those workshops, just briefly? Like, how do you put those together, and what do you find are the things that are most useful to teach people?
Yeah, that's a great question. And if we had another hour, I could answer that question. But I think
Cord, get a workshop. They're great.
I think probably the top couple of headline items that are important are, it's intentionally a collaborative experience from the very first phone call to the last time we walk out the door. And that collaboration takes place between myself and my team and the project sponsors like Melissa or other key stakeholders. And pretty much everybody's welcome to the table in that discussion. We collaboratively co-create the agenda. We identify the topics. We talk about who the right people are to have in the room for that particular topic. We talk about ways to motivate their participation and engagement. We collaborate directly through the workshop, whether that's a half day or the full 2-day one. And we try very much to involve everybody at every step of the way. I have a 20-year background in human-centered design and workshop facilitation, so I've pretty much done everything wrong at least once, which means I can see sometimes some gotchas that are coming down the road a little farther in advance. And I think having whether it's me or somebody else, Melissa has a facilitation background. Many times folks in the workshop will have one. I think having that neutral third party independent perspective on participation in the agenda and the topics and activities is also super critical. That's kind of a structural thing, workshops on how to do workshops. But with respect to the data, literacy and education piece, I think that it's super important to have folks like Melissa involved who have that data background and can help you structure things in a way that it's going to be most appropriate for their audience. So
Awesome. And I think everyone's gonna be able to see why we were hopeful to get you on the curriculum for Forward 50. Melissa, thank you so much for telling the story. Sounds like amazing work, and it kind of gives me hope. So I think I just want to end by saying, don't stop being a Pollyanna, because sometimes you're right. But yeah, this is fantastic stuff, and thank you both for joining us and for sharing the experience with us.
thanks,
Thanks,
Alistair.